One of the most important things to have ready before you can make a great loaf of naturally leavened bread is the natural leavening, or sourdough starter. For this video, I'm going to assume that you already have a starter. If you don't, you need to visit the page in this website, which covers the different ways of acquiring one. Now, it's not necessarily enough just to have some starter on hand. You really want your starter to be at its peak of health on the day you bake, which means that it's fresh, vibrant, and active. But before I go into details, it's good to know that starter, for the most part, is really hardy stuff. It's hard to kill even when you seriously neglect it. It will survive in the refrigerator for weeks at a time with no care at all. So if you're not going to be baking with your starter for long stretches at a time, just keep it in the refrigerator and feed it every couple of weeks or so. That will at least keep it alive and close to ready to use for when you do need it. Fortunately, there's nothing difficult about getting your starter in top shape, and that's really what I'm going to cover in this video. It just so happens that I have in my refrigerator several different starters ranging from very fresh to very badly neglected. By showing you what I would do to bring each of my starters back to usability, I think you'll get a pretty good idea of how to manage your starter. So let's get my starters out of the refrigerator. This is one that I bake with all the time, and so it's very fresh. It probably really won't need much. And this one I made a couple of weeks ago and haven't touched it since. And then this one I haven't touched in months. In fact, I'd be surprised if it's still alive. So let's bring them over to the counter and I'll show you what I'm going to do with them. This is the starter I bake with on a regular basis, and I bake bread approximately weekly, so this starter is in really good shape. Nonetheless, I still want to feed it well the day before I start to bake. And the approximate rule of thumb is that you want to double the quantity of your starter whenever you feed it. In this case, I've got about a cup of starter, so I want to feed it a cup of flour and an approximately equal weight of water, which turns out to be, for each cup of flour, about 2/3 or 3/4 of a cup of water. The other thing to take into consideration is how much starter you're going to need for your recipe. Now, most of the recipes I use call for anywhere from a half a cup to a cup of starter. So if I were to double this, I would have plenty for the next baking and then still have some left over as the seed culture to keep it going. However, my favorite recipe calls for a little over 2 cups of starter. So in that case, I have to actually do some planning ahead and maybe start 2 days before I'm going to bake and feed it a couple of times, maybe 3 times even, to build it up to have the quantity of starter that I need to bake and still have some left over. Another thing is that when you're feeding your starter just prior to baking, you can keep your starter at room temperature right after you feed it. But if you're just wanting to keep your starter alive, then you can take it out of the refrigerator, feed it, and put it right back in the refrigerator. It doesn't have to sit out at room temperature. Okay, so now this other starter I have is one that I haven't fed for a couple weeks. Now, if I was actually going to bake with it, what I would want to do, since I want to double the volume before I bake, and there's quite a lot here, is rather than having to double the approximately 2 cups of starter that's in here, what I'm going to do is dump some out. And so I would just dump it down the drain. And, rinse it down the drain with cold water. Works pretty well. Then, now I'm down to about a cup of starter. And what I want to do is the same thing that I just described with the starter I use on a regular basis. And that's add about a cup of flour and 3/4 of a cup of water. And let it sit at room temperature if I was planning on baking with it. And since I haven't used the starter in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm probably going to want to feed it over the course of a couple days to bring it up to full potency. Now, this is the starter that's been sitting in the back of my refrigerator, solely neglected for at least 2 months. And yet, from what I know about sourdough starters, I bet you this one is still alive, and it'll be fun to see if we can revive it. Now, one thing you'll find when you've neglected your starter as long as I have is that a clearish liquid will form on the top. This is an alcohol that's called hooch. And what you can do when that forms is just pour it off. And so I'll just dump that down the drain. And there's not much starter in here. So we'll just start from here and add about a cup of flour, and about 2/3 of a cup of water, and mix it up and see if we can't get it to come back to life. This one, because it's been so long since we've used it, I would probably feed it for several days before I actually start using it again. So it was yesterday afternoon that I fed my badly abused starter, and in only a few hours it was obvious that the starter was going to be fine. It rose and bubbled like a normal starter will do when you feed it. A true testament to the hardiness of this stuff. So like I said, it's very difficult to kill starter. The only time I've managed to do so unintentionally was about 30 years ago when I was out of the country for 6 months and I put it in the freezer. You can freeze starter, but only after drying it first, as I cover in another video on drying starter for long-term storage. Now, even though this starter is going to be fine, it's still a little anemic, so I'm going to feed it a couple more times before I attempt to use it. In fact, I'll show you what I'm going to do. So this is the starter, and I think the camera will probably pick up that it's quite bubbly and kind of foamy. So the starter will be fine, but after several months of inactivity in the refrigerator, it's definitely going to need several more feedings before I would attempt to bake with it again. Now, as I mentioned before, whenever you feed your starter, you want to approximately double the volume. And there's a good 1.5 cups in here, and that's more than I really want to have to double. So I'm going to take out 1/2 cup and just work with that. And the other thing is I want to clean this jar out. So this will be good for illustration purposes anyway. I'm going to put about 1/2 cup in this clear-ish container and add 1/2 cup of flour and about 1/3 cup of water. And mix it up. Probably the single best way to know that your starter is at optimal strength and ready to be used is when you add your flour and water, note the level of the starter after you're done stirring. And within a few hours at room temperature, the volume of the starter should have about doubled. So right now the starter is right about here. And let's check back in a few hours and see how it's doing. Okay, it's been exactly 3.5 hours since we fed the starter, and you can see it's risen quite substantially. It hasn't quite doubled in volume, but pretty close. I'd say it's up about 2/3 from its original level. This is the kind of activity you want to see in a healthy culture. Now, because this culture has been so dormant for so long, I would still feed it at least a couple more times before I used it for baking. So that's it for this video on sourdough culture maintenance. Between this video and my other videos on sourdough culture, hopefully you'll develop a pretty decent feel for how to manage your own. I hope I haven't left out too many important points, but if you do have any questions or run into any problems, please don't hesitate to contact me. There's a place at the bottom of this page where you can write, and I'll do my best to get the answers that you need.